Hi, thanks for joining me for this Kansas Teaching and Leading Project webinar on progress monitoring students in grades K through 5. I'm Denise Brown, and I serve as a reading coach for the Kansas MTSS and Alignment Project. We're excited to be able to partner with the Literacy Network of Kansas and this Teaching and Leading Project and KSDE to bring these webinars to you. I have 4 objectives for our time together. First, I'd like to give you a rationale for why we should even progress monitor students and how often that progress monitor should take place. Then we'll talk about how to select the right progress monitoring tool for your students. And then finally, it's well and good to take progress monitoring data, but it's a bigger issue to know how to actually interpret that. So we'll finish by talking about how to interpret what you're seeing in that data for your students. So if you're ready, let's get started. Our first objective is simply a question: why progress monitor? Whether it's that new diet you've committed to or the to-do list that I have sitting on my desk right now with tasks I need to complete, the bottom line is always true. If I know there is some sort of accountability for me to complete that, I'm a lot more likely to actually execute that plan. I think the same thing is true when we make a plan for students around an intervention. We put this together, we have great ideas, but if I know that it's being measured in some way, I'm probably more likely to execute that in a consistent way. So while progress monitoring does help hold me accountable, it also really helps inform my decisions. We know that students are much more aware of their own performance and actually, in many cases, achieve more when we know someone is measuring that progress. Even the youngest students understand the concept of an aim line and whether our data point lands above or below the line this week. Besides the students, as a teacher, I make a lot better decisions when I have progress monitoring data. I no longer have to depend on my gut or how I think it's going when I can actually look at hard data and see what's happening in relationship to that trend line. I think my favorite story about progress monitor occurred several years ago when I was working with a district where a lot of the parents themselves were actually illiterate. As you might imagine, they were excited to see their students actually be getting some extra reading instruction that maybe they hadn't gotten as children themselves. So the school made the decision to send home progress monitoring graphs, I think about once a month. And what they discovered was kind of fascinating. Those parents who were functionally illiterate could read a graph. They could read a trend line on a line graph. And so they would begin to call schools. Parents who didn't normally call and make any kind of contact with the teachers whatsoever were calling when the dot fell below the line and saying, is there something I need to be doing at home? I think that's a very powerful testimony of what progress monitoring can do for me as a teacher, but also for my students and their families. So progress monitoring really should work sort of like a GPS on your phone. It should be able to tell me if a student is making progress, if they're making enough progress, and in some cases, it may need to help me reroute my instruction. A really strong progress monitoring tool will actually help me look at the effectiveness of the intervention that I'm giving students and estimate where they're going to be in the future if we continue to progress the way we seem to be progressing. I think it's also important to note that it should be very sensitive to even the smallest changes in growth. Often larger measures of general outcome measures won't show those little tiny pieces, and so we need to be able to measure even the tiniest bits of growth when our students are needing intervention. You know, I think it's really easy to think of progress monitoring as one more thing I need to put on that to-do list on my desk. But progress monitoring has really never been about compliance. The purpose of it really is to guide instruction. So I need to be prepared to do some reflecting and thinking, looking at the data that I have in front of me and laying it alongside as I think about what's happened during that intervention or that instructional time during the last week or 2 weeks, what's been different for the students or different for an individual student. And then I act in a way that I reform my instruction in response to that information. I think it's really easy when I see a student who is not making progress to begin to assume that it's a student issue. That maybe because they have special education services or title services, or there's behavior issues, or their home life or foster care. But when it comes to a progress monitor and making decisions, we really need to push all of that off the table. The focus really has to be on what I have control of. The truth is, instruction is powerful and instruction matters. So when I begin to focus on what I have control of and what it's going to take for this student to make progress, I'm going to find that much more is in my control than I might realize. It truly is the relentless pursuit of student learning. So we've talked about why we should progress monitor. Let's now look at how often that should occur. Often a trend I see when I begin working with schools is a tendency to postpone progress monitoring for 9 weeks or even a semester. But the truth is, when you begin to intervene with students, you're going to lose some really important data early on. Susan Hall mentions that it's the data that motivates teachers, but it's also the data that motivates students. It gives us a sense of whether we're headed in the right direction. So I want to encourage you not to postpone too long the start of a progress monitor within your building. When it comes to deciding how often we progress monitor, the short answer is it really depends. For students who show Tier 2 needs, we like to see progress monitoring happening about every other week. For our most intense friends, students who show Tier 3 needs, progress monitoring probably should happen every week. Now, when we're looking at students who fall at Tier 1, generally we don't progress monitor those students. But there are a couple of caveats. One would be if there's a student, especially in early literacy, that I've got concerns. I just feel like she's not growing like her peers. It's very appropriate to do a quick dipstick and see if, in fact, they are making growth. And a progress monitor is a great way to do that. The other students in Tier 1 that I might consider progress monitoring would be a student who has been in intervention but has recently moved back to a benchmark group. I may want to look at them about once a month for a couple months just to make sure that they are continuing to progress the way we anticipated they would. When it comes to trying to make a decision for kids, a general rule of thumb is if I need to make a decision quickly on whether an intervention is working, I might want to tighten up the time frame so I could progress monitor more often to give me enough data to make a good, solid decision for that student. So you know why you should progress monitor and about how often. Now let's talk about how you can select the right tool to progress monitor your student. The second type of progress monitor are those informal progress monitoring measures. You know, probably no one understands informal progress monitoring better than a pre-K teacher. Those mastery skills checklists that they use are a great way for them to informally monitor the progress of students. In that similar format, when I'm in an intervention, I might choose to give a short post-assessment. If the skill this week, say, is A silent E, I might give students just a quick review, just a short 4 or 5 words, just to see if they've got it at Tier 2 or Tier 3. So it's a measure not of their general growth in phonics, but a measure of their growth in just that specific skill. At Tier 1, we do informal progress monitoring all the time. It's our on-the-bell activities and it's our exit tickets. It's using Kahoots and thumbs up, thumbs down. Anything I can use to measure students' understanding in the moment would be considered an informal progress monitor. There's some fairly important matches that we need to make when we begin to set up progress monitoring. First, we need to match the focus of instruction. If a student is a 4th or 5th grader and they're really working in very primary skills like short vowels, it doesn't make a lot of sense to give them an oral reading fluency passage designed for a 4th or 5th grade student, because I'm probably not going to be able to see the kind of growth they're making. Students with that sort of need would probably best be served using a nonsense word fluency progress monitor, and in some cases even picking up a phonological processing progress monitor as well. Check your assessment system, because some assessment systems will ask you to find the instructional level for a student when you progress monitor. So a student at 5th grade who is not at benchmark on that passage, the system might ask you to back up and give a 4th grade passage and then a 3rd grade passage until you find the instructional level for that student. But again, follow the directions of your system. There are others that do not ask for that. I think making sure we have the best person to administer that progress monitor is equally important. Depending on the student, you as a teacher may know who they will best perform for, and we do want to get a measure of what they look like on a typical day in a typical setting. So my personal preference is if I'm the interventionist, I'd like to be the one that gives the progress monitor, because I can see those patterns of mistakes they're making, that will help me further adjust instruction for them the next time we're together. It's a lot different to have someone just hand me a number than it is to actually watch a child perform. So really think hard about who is the best person to give that. And then finally, if you're going to ask me to give it, make sure that I've been trained in how to give that measure appropriately. So let's play a little bit with matching students with the right progress monitoring tool. You have 4 students on your screen. The first one is Alana. She's a 4th grader. She's reading below benchmark for rate. So whatever the words correct per minute is for her grade level, her rate is below that. But she's also less than 90% accurate. We know that research tells us that students need to be about 95% accurate for their phonics to be strong enough to support comprehension. So Alana's got a lot of things going on right now. Obviously, her intervention would be in the area of phonics, and we would do some further diagnostics probably to figure out where she stopped or where her holes are in her phonics background. But her progress monitor tool would be an oral reading fluency probe. However, we wouldn't be watching how many words correct per minute she's reading as much as we'd be watching what her percent of accuracy is doing. Once she's showing a consistent performance at 95% or above, we'd want to move her into a fluency intervention, and at that point our eye would be on the rate instead of the percent of accuracy. So now let's look at Juan. Juan's a kindergartner, and he's demonstrated low phonemic awareness, which is at the sound level, and he also doesn't know all of his letter sounds. When we're at kindergarten and 1st grade, there are a lot of skills that are coming in very quickly for those friends. And so we want to keep a finger on the pulse of how quickly both of those skills are coming into place, both the phonological and the phonics pieces. So it might be that 1 week I would progress monitor Juan on his maybe onset sound in the fall, but by winter I would progress monitor once a week on phoneme segmentation or word segmenting. And then the other week I'd probably want to do some kind of a measure of his letter sounds, letter names. So I could alternate every other week what I use for progress monitor to ensure that he's beginning to build those foundational skills to be able to orthographically map effectively and effortlessly. Finally, let's look at Delaney. Delaney's a 5th grader. When we gave her the oral reading fluency, she was very accurate. She was coming in 98, 99% accurate. So phonics is not an issue for her, but her rate certainly is because she was below benchmark. So once again, like Alana, we would be using an oral reading fluency probe to progress monitor her. However, with Delaney, rather than watching accuracy because it's in place, we would begin to watch her rate, and that's how we would progress monitor her. All right, you now know why you need to progress monitor, how often you need to progress monitor, and you've probably even determined what progress monitor tool you might want to use with a student. Now let's talk about what to do with that data when it starts coming in. We sincerely hope you are not having to make decisions on progress monitoring data on an island. The truth is a collaborative team comes together, and when great minds begin to talk about and discuss, great things happen for kids. As that first round of data begins to come in, there are 2 questions that we need to ask. The first question is that student making progress? And I want to encourage you as a teacher and as a team to celebrate those victories, both as a staff, but also with your students. Often the older students get, the less gets celebrated about their learning, and so make sure that you celebrate that progress. But I think the second question is equally important, and that question is it enough progress to close the gap? It's one thing to make a year's progress, but keep in mind that so do that student's peers. So the gap never changes even with just a year's progress. We want to see if we can get more than a year's progress or accelerate the growth for our students who are behind so that we can begin to narrow or close that gap. Here you see just some general considerations when you begin talking about what you might do for a student or a group of students when the gap is not closing. First of all, you want to check what you're monitoring, and I would go back and look at that, how I matched the progress monitoring tool with what we're actually doing in intervention. Second, I'd look at the fidelity of instruction. Is intervention happening every day? Are we using the materials that we've agreed that we would use? Often schools that we work with in an MTSS process have put together what they call a protocol, and that's almost a prescription, if you will. So when a student displays this reading issue, this is what we always use first. we're really at a place right now where we know so much about how students read and what causes reading difficulties. We really can't leave curriculum selection or use to chance. So check that fidelity of instruction. You might also look at the pace of instruction. And I know that bullet 3 seems a little odd. As teachers, we think if we keep saying it and we say it louder and slower, eventually kids are going to catch it. But the truth is some of our friends really need us to increase the pace. I did some work just this week in a classroom modeling some instruction, and we tightened down. We had an 8-minute intervention time. And can I tell you, the pace of my instruction went up exponentially when I knew I only had 8 minutes. But what I also found was the number of students' opportunities increased, their engagement also increased. So think about increasing the pace of that instruction. We also want to make sure that our programs are aligned. What I mean by that is if we're looking at the order that letters are introduced in our core, the way they're introduced in intervention ought to match that. Likewise, the instructional practices ought to match as well. If I'm calling it silent E in intervention and the core is calling it state your name E, our students who struggle the most are going to have a really difficult time understanding that we're talking about the very same thing. So ensure that those programs are aligned, that intervention is not rolling ahead or in a different order than what your core is actually teaching those syllable types or letters. Also take a look at adjusting your materials if they don't align. So those small adjustments can make a big difference. Keep in mind that your core should set the pace, intervention should follow. The very last suggestion is to look at moving that student to a different group. And we place that last because often that's our first thought. And there are a whole lot of other things that we could have done before we changed a group. So just a good place to get you started with those conversations. Here's some questions to spur those conversations we've been talking about. Asking things like, have we done anything different? Have we had intervention every day? What are the things that maybe have been done different? Do we have the right goal set for that student? Are we looking at the right thing as we progress monitor? I love bullet 4. Is this student different from other students? Occasionally you'll have one student who responds incredibly well to an intervention compared to, say, the other 4 students in that group. Or the opposite's also true. You might have 3 students who are responding really well and one that's been kind of an outlier. The question is, in both of those cases, what's been different for that student? Is it attendance? Is it repetitions? What is the thing that maybe is different for them? We also need to think about, have we given something enough time to work? The older a student gets, the wider the gap is probably becoming or could be becoming. So we need to look at giving something enough time to actually begin to take hold. So if I'm seeing growth in some of those informal progress monitors early on, I may want to stay the course for just a little bit longer until the formal progress monitor also shows that growth. Has the instruction been delivered as planned? With the best of intentions, interruptions happen at school. It's fire drills, it's special guest speakers, it's special events, it's reduced days. So when we think about has instruction been delivered as planned, often our data is reflective of that very inconsistency. I'll never forget several years ago I had a grade level where all of their interventions, the students were not showing the growth we would have expected. And when we dug in just a little bit, we discovered that grade level had set aside interventions for a few weeks to practice for a program. Now I understand that the program is very important and being ready to perform is important, but perhaps a different time of day might have been a better time. But it was what impacted the data, and we could have very quickly changed the intervention without actually knowing the root cause. I think that bold question in the bottom really is the golden question. What will it take to enable learning for this student? All things aside, what's it going to take to move the needle? When we begin to come in and narrow our focus on the progress monitoring data and what we're seeing and beginning to make decisions, we might talk about the idea that we might just need to intensify instruction. So just turn up the heat a little bit for that student who's making progress, but we'd like to see them make just a little more to begin to close that gap. These are some very quick and easy ways that you can intensify instruction as a starting point for you. So you might talk about how I could increase their opportunities per minute to respond. We mentioned the one student out of 4 that maybe isn't responding as well as the others. What I could simply do with that student is to start with her, ask another friend, come back to her, ask another friend, come back to her. So she's ending up getting about 4 times the opportunities her friends are within that group. And we hope that might be enough to just intensify her instruction. You could also look at how you correct errors. I really like how Carol Disson does this. Carol simply, when a student reads a word incorrectly, she simply stops and says, "My turn." She reads the word correctly, then says, "Your turn," and has the student repeat it. So the student has a chance to orthographically map that word by hearing it correctly and then also reading it again correctly before she moves on. She doesn't spend a lot of time saying, "I know you thought that was a short A, but there's an E at the end, so that's a long E." There's none of that instruction. It's just a very quick, "My turn," correct word, "your turn," and they also repeat it. So I think it also takes a lot of the pressure off and the focus on a student that sometimes makes them uncomfortable. So just a quick objective correction. When I think about increasing scaffolding, I'm really thinking about the idea of trying to break that task down more or providing some structures so that that student can be successful. Anita Archer is really the queen of explicit instruction. You've seen probably multiple times and heard her say, "I do, we do, you do." But what I've heard her talk about recently is that it's often we go too quickly away from the we do to the you do. And it might need to be, "I do, we do, we do, we do, we do," then you do. So making sure that we increase the number of repetition cycles with that skill at the we do level where it's a supported practice before I actually turn them loose. And then finally, you may want to think about the curriculum that you're actually using. Making sure that you have a systematic curriculum so that your skills are being taught in a prescribed order and the teacher's asking questions and she's cueing with the language from each one of those routines. When we make routines very tight, instructional routines, we free up the students' working memory to not learn my routine, but instead learn the actual content I'm trying to teach. It's a very powerful tool in a teacher's hands. Oh, goodness, we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. If you're thinking about next steps from this webinar, we have some ideas just in the form of questions. First of all, when we think about access to progress monitors, do we have some probes that are part of our assessment system? And if so, how do I get access to those? And along with that comes the administration of it. If I have access, have I been trained, or is there someone in the district who could train me in using those progress monitor probes? I'm thinking in particular of older students who need a younger probe. Generally speaking, we've not been taught to give nonsense word or a phoneme segmentation. So is there someone in the district who would do that for me so that I would be able to successfully use that progress monitor tool? And then the problem-solving questions really fall in the lap of the leaders within your building. Do we really have the time for our teachers to sit down and collaboratively look at that progress monitoring data instead of asking them to make those decisions on their own? And then more importantly, do we have a systematic way to respond to the students who are not showing progress? What do we have in place as our method of responding? So I am beyond grateful that you chose to take time out of your very busy schedule to spend time with me talking about progress monitoring. This module has been developed with funds from the Literacy Network of Kansas, also known as LINK, and it's a Striving Readers Comprehensive Literacy Initiative in partnership with University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning. We worked with the Kansas State Department of Education on this grant, as well as the Kansas Teaching and Leading Project. This grant is designed to improve literacy not only at the state level, but also at the regional and the local community level. If you'd like more information on this topic or other topics related to this project, you're welcome to email Cindy Haddocky or Joanne McCrell at KSDE. Their emails are provided on this slide, as is my email. Please follow the link to access the quiz, your certificate of completion, and the PowerPoint notes from today. Thanks again for joining me.